The worst part was the applause. I was standing on a riser under a cheap spotlight in conference room C when he leaned over the microphone, smiled that way he always did when he thought he had won, and said, "Do not act like you matter here." The room went quiet except for the scraping of chairs and the soft clicking of someone's phone. My chest went cold, and I remember hearing my own heartbeat like a drum. It was the moment everything I had worked for in the last 2 years felt like it had been erased in one sentence. I should back up. I am Amelia. For 4 years, I ran the grants and compliance portfolio at Meadowcrest Learning Center, a mid-sized private school network in the United States that also contracted with a small education consulting firm called Horizon Education Partners. My title was Senior Program Coordinator for Student Services, and my job was boring on paper but important in practice. I tracked attendance records, audit evidence, parent consents, vendor invoices, and the metrics that kept our contract bonuses intact. In our world, one missed signature or one overlooked invoice could cost 6 figures and wreck reputations. The issue at the center of this mess was a performance bonus worth $1,200,000 tied to a donor performance agreement. The donor had attached that money to a set of targets: a 95% attendance threshold, accurate completion of student intake forms, and a timely third-party audit. I had spent months building a compliance folder titled Performance Bonus $1,200,000 Evidence, with subfolders for attendance exports, scanned consent forms, weekly audit logs, and a rolling risk register. I put dates on everything. I sent calendar invites to the project director and to the leadership distribution list with subject lines like meeting, Performance Bonus $1,200,000 Risk Review March 12, 2019. I flagged specific risks in red. I wrote an email on March 12, 2019 with the subject Documented Risk, Attendance Data Integrity, and attached a 2-page spreadsheet that showed an unusual drop in attendance reporting for one campus. I asked for a mitigation plan. I did the job I had been hired for. The project director was Darren Cole. He was the kind of leader who smiled while he steamrolled people. His core flaw was ego wrapped in confidence. He wanted credit and he wanted control. He loved awards. He loved being the center of a room. He also liked to present solutions he had not fully understood as if they were his own genius. That trait came with a blind spot. He ignored details he thought were beneath him. I warned him about the attendance discrepancy and the missing consent forms. I told him, if we do not fix this, we risk losing the $1,200,000. He said, we will handle it. And then he handled it the way he handled everything he wanted to control, by delegating the parts he did not like and taking the credit for the things that went well. The betrayal started small and then widened. The first cut was when Darren circulated a 1-page summary to the board and to Horizon Education Partners as if we'd always been green across every key indicator. He wrote key performance indicator in the summary, when in fact my spreadsheet with the flagged attendance issues sat unanswered in my inbox. He had deleted my risk paragraph from a combined report and replaced it with a line that said, Project Risk Addressed by Team. The board praised him in the next week for excellent stewardship and for keeping things on track. I stayed calm. I emailed him a note, can we add my risk log to the board packet? He replied, not necessary. This will create public noise. I took a breath, and I saved his reply to my risk folder. Escalation followed in stages over the next 27 months. Each stage was worse than the last, and each left me a little more isolated. The first escalation cost me reputation. At the quarterly review in June, Darren told the leadership team that an implementation delay was my fault because a compliance package had not been completed. I had the package. I had the time-stamped folder labeled Compliance Third-Party Audit, July 2019, and a calendar invite that showed the audit coordinator had confirmed receipt on July 2, 2019. Darren produced a different folder, an edited one without my audit checklist, and said, Amelia did not provide the audit evidence in time. People nodded. Leadership thanked Darren for stepping in. I smiled politely and did not raise my voice. I walked back to my desk and printed the original folder. I logged an incident in our ticketing system that night with the subject ticket 4831, audit evidence provided C attachments. I attached the calendar invite, the staff sign-off, and the original checklist. I also copied the audit coordinator and asked for a short note that confirmed delivery. She replied the next morning. She said, We received the documents on July 2, 2019. I saved that email. The second escalation cost me opportunity. A pilot program with Larchwood Charter was supposed to be the next step for my team. It was a 200,000 engagement to roll out a new attendance platform that would be the showcase for the donor portfolio. Darren pushed to lead that rollout because it would make a clean narrative for him at the year-end. 2 weeks before the pilot launch, he switched the vendor contract dates and reallocated a portion of the 200,000 implementation budget to his pet analytics vendor without telling me. When the vendor invoices arrived, the math was off and implementation stalled. Larchwood called and said their trainers could not access the platform. Darren blamed me for not scheduling the trainers. I kept my cool. I texted the vendor contracts manager and asked for the invoice reconciliation. I printed an invoice with number LCH 2019-047 that clearly showed the payment was redirected by Darren's team. I also had a chain of calendar invites where Darren had accepted a meeting titled Contract Reallocation Review on August 14, 2019. I attached those invites to Ticket 4912, Invoice Discrepancy, Larchwood Pilot. I did not storm into Darren's office. I documented. The third escalation was the hardest. Trust evaporated in slow motion. One of Darren's emails, the one he sent to the donor liaison, contained a line that read, "We are confident Amelia will handle the consent forms." When the donor later complained because the consent forms were not properly indexed, Darren forwarded that same email to leadership as proof that I had been responsible and had failed. He wrote in the text, "Why did Amelia not follow through on the donor consents?" Leadership called me into a meeting room called Conference Room A. They asked me to explain. I told them the truth. I had created Consent Index V3 on October 10, 2019, and I had attached a receipt-style list with 312 signatures and a screenshot titled Scan Consent 312, PNG. But nobody looked at the screenshot. Darren had already planted the narrative that I was careless. He put a tentative note in my performance review stating missed donor consents jeopardized bonus. It was the sentence that mattered. My promotion pipeline closed overnight. There were 3 more cuts after that, each one smaller in scope but larger in impact. A finance analyst I had worked with for 2 years, Mr. Patel, started avoiding eye contact after Darren privately told finance that I had been slow and unresponsive. A teacher coordinator, Rosa, who had relied on my attendance exports, was moved off our team because Darren wanted a clean slate for his success story. A parent liaison who had been a longtime ally had her letters to parents reassigned by Darren without explanation. Those 6 small betrayals, finance, teacher, parent liaison, audit coordinator, vendor manager, and the Larchwood contact added up. By month 18, I had fewer allies and fewer people willing to back me up in meetings. Darren would smile and say, "Amelia has been overwhelmed," in staff meetings. I stopped correcting him in public. I logged evidence and I worked harder. There was a genuine low point in month 22. I was called to human resources for a formal coaching conversation. They showed me a list of missed deadlines and a draft of a disciplinary letter that recommended a 90-day improvement plan. The letter cited the missing consent index and the Larchwood invoice confusion. I remember sitting across the table from a human resources representative named Angela, who was kind, and telling her, "I have every email and calendar invite. I will bring them." Angela looked at me with sympathy and said, "Bring what you can and we will review." I went back to my desk, and for the first time in my career, I felt like I had been publicly, legally, systematically stripped of credit for work I had done. I thought I had lost. I imagined resigning, starting over. I left my bag in the office and went home that night and lay on my couch and let my anger be small and steady like a fire. But I did not quit my job the next morning. I did something more strategic. For months before that low point, I had been quietly building a paper and digital trail that would survive a narrative attack. I kept receipts and ticket numbers and calendar invites. I printed every email that mentioned the donor performance bonus and stamped it with a file name and a date. I created a running timeline document I called Timeline Performance Bonus 1,200,000, and I updated it every time something happened. The timeline had 31 entries by the time the award ceremony rolled around. Dates, meeting room numbers, names, and attachments. It included meeting minutes risk review room 212, 2019-0503, ticket 4831, calendar invite meeting. Audit coordinator confirmation, 2019-0702, invoice LCH 2019-047, and even a scanned bank deposit slip that matched an invoice I had submitted on September 9, 2019. The other leverage was people. Over the 27 months, 6 witnesses had accumulated without me trying to make them a team. Mr. Patel in finance had saved the invoice reconciliation. He had an export file titled Finance Export, Sept 2019, CSV that showed the payment reallocation. Rosa, the teacher coordinator, had printed the attendance roster that showed my original entries and annotations in my handwriting. The donor liaison had a copy of my March risk email in her own folder and had flagged it in her notes. The Larchwood pilot lead, Ms. Rivera, had stuck with us longer than she needed to and had kept messages showing she had escalated contract changes back to Darren. Darren's own executive assistant, Cara, had saved draft emails he had never sent and had, by habit, saved the versions where he typed, "We will reassign this to Amelia." Cara did not like conflict and stayed quiet for months, but when I asked her if she still had message drafts she said, "I have them saved." That was a small surprise. One of my quietest allies turned out to be his assistant. 2 unexpected twists helped pull everything together. First, Darren had a habit of preparing overly theatrical acceptance speeches and then saving them in a shared drive under a folder called Speeches Darren. He assumed those drafts were private. He was careless. One of those files had a line that read, "We will make sure the $1,200,000 is not at risk. Amelia will fix the paperwork. If she cannot, I will step in." The file was dated March 14, 2020. The second twist was that the donor liaison, Ms. Alvarez, had been trying to resolve the attendance discrepancy for months and had kept copies of every summary. When she saw the folders I had assembled, she offered to be a witness and to put her name to a single-page statement of facts she would present if needed. She said, "The donor deserves the truth." She did not say that lightly. The award ceremony was supposed to be Darren's moment. Horizon Education Partners had flown in several clients, donors, and the leadership team. The room was full of people who loved a tidy success story. Darren had been nominated for Program Excellence Award for shepherding the donor portfolio. I had to go because I was on the same team and because I had a small role in organizing the event. My plan was simple: be there, be calm, and be ready. I brought 2 things in my bag: a printed binder with a table of contents and digital copies on a secure thumb drive. The binder had 12 attachments and a 1-page executive timeline that fit on the inside cover. I did not plan to storm the stage. I planned to speak at the right moment. Right after Darren made that comment, he said, "Do not act like you matter here." The room tilted. I remember thinking how small the stage looked from the crowd. I also remember Ms. Alvarez standing up in the second row with a donor badge pinned to her lapel and calling out, "Who approved the decision to reallocate the Larchwood invoice?" She was not supposed to do that. The room went very quiet again. Darren blinked. He smiled the way someone would when a plan starts to leak. Ms. Rivera from Larchwood stood next to Ms. Alvarez. She demanded a public explanation because their school had missed the pilot launch. She said, "We have emails showing the contract changes. We need to know who signed off." The chief operating officer of Horizon Education Partners turned to me and asked, "Amelia, can you explain what happened?" I could have nodded and let someone else speak. Instead, I walked forward with my binder. I felt a precise calm in my chest, like everything had been practiced in a quiet room. I laid the binder on a table by the microphone and I said, "I have a timeline and supporting documents that show when I raised risks and who saw them." I told him, "I will read 3 items aloud." I read the dates, the subject lines, and a short sentence for each. March 12, 2019, documented risk, attendance data integrity. July 2, 2019, audit evidence received, audit coordinator confirmed receipt. August 14, 2019, calendar invite contract reallocation review, accepted by Darren Cole. I did not raise my voice. I watched faces change. Ms. Alvarez produced her own folder and went to the podium. She said, "We have the original donor communication," and she read a line from the donor that said, "We reserve the right to withhold the $1,200,000 if evidence is not provided." A few people gasped. The room had been holding its breath. I opened to the attachment that had Darren's draft speech and read the sentence where he acknowledged the risk and suggested I would be responsible. The room murmured. Darren's confident mask faltered for the first time in months. Someone in the back said, "So why was the audit checklist missing from the board packet?" I turned to the person who asked and said, "Because the board packet was edited. I have the original packet and the email trail that shows the edits." I said it like stating a fact and not like an accusation. The chief operating officer asked to see the binder. Darren's reaction was the last twist. He stood in front of everyone and for a moment attempted the plausible excuse he had used in meetings: miscommunication. Then a message popped up on the projector of his phone, a calendar notification that he had accepted a meeting titled Contract Reallocation Review. It flashed his name. He swallowed and his face emptied out. He looked at me and then to the room and said, "I should have listened to you." I did not. It was not a dramatic confession. It was small and humiliating in the way that makes silence louder. He had to say it. He did not deny the chain of documents on the table. What followed was a slow unpacking rather than an immediate firing. Horizon Education Partners opened an investigation. The donor paused the disbursement pending an audit. Darren was removed from the program leadership while the review took place and his responsibilities were reassigned. Human Resources and the Chief Operating Officer asked me to sit with them to go through the binder in detail. They read the emails and calendar invites. They watched the timeline and they listened to witness statements. Mr. Patel in finance made a short, quiet statement about the invoice reallocation and handed over the finance export SEP 2019 CSV file. Kara, Darren's assistant, reluctantly uploaded the draft speech file and the saved message drafts. Rosa handed over the attendance roster. Each item stitched the story together. I was asked one direct question: could I fix what had been broken? Could I step in and reorganize the contract and get the pilot back on track? Darren hoped I would. There was a tense moment where Darren looked at me with pleading that had nothing to do with leadership and everything to do with self-preservation. He wanted me to be his rescue plan while his public image was intact. I looked at the documents and at the donor representatives and then I said, "No." I did not say it angrily. I said it like a closing statement. I told him, "I will not be the person who cleans up a pattern that put our donor funds at risk. Let the process play out." I walked off the stage and left him to face the consequences. Months later, the investigation found that there had been repeated lapses in documentation and poor decisions that fell squarely on the project director's leadership. He was not fired the same day. Real organizations do not operate that way. He was put on performance improvement and reassigned to a non-client-facing role. The donor required stricter oversight and a partial hold on the $1,200,000 until a third-party audit completed the work I had documented. In the end, the donor released the money because the audit confirmed our original evidence, but the leadership changes were permanent. Darren kept a role at the company, but his path to promotion was over. I was offered two things almost immediately after the public reversal. The first was a formal apology from the Chief Operating Officer at Horizon Education Partners and an assurance that I would have a chance to reapply for the position I had been denied. The second was an offer from Ms. Rivera at Larchwood to lead their district implementation team for a salary that was 30% higher and with an actual director title. I took the latter. I had reached my low point in that dingy human resources office, and I had chosen to stay and document. Leaving for a better role felt like closing a chapter with my dignity intact. There are a few things I still think about. I learned that documentation matters more than righteous anger. I learned that staying calm and strategic in conversations that beg for drama is both boring and powerful. I also learned that people who want to control a narrative will always assume others will not keep records. Keep records. Save the calendar invites. Save the receipts. Ask for confirmation in writing. Those small habits were the difference between being pushed out and being vindicated. I do not gloat. Darren made mistakes and had to accept the fallout. I left the company with a clear conscience and a new role where my work mattered and where people read the emails I sent. The satisfaction was not destroying him. The satisfaction was finally being seen.